Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Morning Shot.
Welcome to Morning Shot. World leaders are gathering in New York this week for the 80th UN General Assembly. On the agenda are some of the world's most pressing crises. The wars in Gaza and Ukraine, climate change, and women's rights are all in focus. U.S. President Donald Trump's fiery speech set the tone early, doubling down on migration and energy while taking aim at the UN itself. To help us make sense of the debates so far, the key moments still to come, and what they mean for Singapore, we're joined by Bhavan Jaipragas, Deputy Opinion Editor at the Straits Times. Bhavan, good morning. Nice to have you on.
Good morning. Nice to be back on the show.
Yes, so the UNGA is marking its 80th session under the theme Better Together, 80 Years and More for Peace, Development and Human Rights. And yet, here we have, Bhavan, U.S. President Donald Trump in a 56-minute speech preaching quite the opposite. So he accused environmentalists of wanting to kill all the cows. He personally insulted the Muslim mayor of London. He bashed allies across the globe, saying, your countries are going to hell, allies and foes, that is. He questioned whether the UN should even exist. What do you make of such statements being made by such an influential global figure at such a grand stage that should be serving as a forum for member states to come together and discuss the way forward?
There has not been in recent history a UN, in such a point of crisis. This is the America that midwives the United Nations after the Second World War, and today contributes about a fifth of UN annual budget. And here you have the leader of that country basically eviscerating the organization, saying it is irrelevant, suggesting that that it cannot stop the wars that it was designed to do. So we hear from the diplomats at the UN, about this talk of a world -1 scenario that they are increasingly having to deal with. And in that kind of milieu, all the various important things that countries are thinking about, whether it's the Gaza war, the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, or the fighting still going on in Ukraine, this seems to be taking a backseat to the rhetoric of President Trump. Yeah, I think as a whole, really quite a sorry state for the UN, given the high expectations the international community has of U.S. leadership.
President Trump has also demanded an immediate investigation into what he claimed was triple sabotage during his UN visit, citing a stopped escalator and a teleprompter that wasn't working. Is this increasing evidence of a growing wedge that's being driven between the UN and a key member of the organization in the United States? How might this affect the perception that other member states carry, and what does it say about the state of multilateralism in 2025?
Firstly, on the triple sabotage, this is seriously just another indication of just how unserious this administration is. So the escalator failed likely because the videographer who was following Melania Trump had pressed the emergency button. And she sent the speech talking about these things, talking about not receiving the contract to renovate the United Nations several years ago. Really unserious. And here we have people dying, wars that need to be stopped. It cannot be done without the world's, superpower. So if you talk to diplomats, even the diplomats here in Singapore, foreign diplomats, they insist that conflict will still need mediation or discussion at the United Nations. It cannot fail. So we are in this situation where countries need to somehow find a way around this function that current administration in Washington is inflicting on the UN.
Let's turn to a central flashpoint this year, of course, the Gaza-Israel war. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu scheduled to speak, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas appearing by video as well. What kind of dynamics are you expecting around the conflict, especially given Washington's current position and the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
Yeah, we had domestic discussion on this as well. This topic of recognition, the various European powers that decided to go ahead with recognizing the state of Palestine do so because they want to forestall kind of elimination by Israel of the two-state solution, right? That is forefront of any discussion on the Palestine question at this high-level meeting. As you know, of course, the Americans are adamantly against any kind of recognition. They are really not pleased with their Western partners for going ahead with this move. In my mind, diplomatically, it remains impractical. It will change the course of the conflict. Will be facts on the ground, whether ceasefire is agreed to, whether Hamas agrees to release the hostages, and then subsequently the Israeli government decides that it's now ready for a ceasefire. I don't see any kind of discussion at the United Nations having a material effect on the facts on the ground for the conflict.
Yeah, now we were talking about Gaza being a central flashpoint this year. Perhaps no surprises that U.S. President Donald Trump has downplayed Palestinian statehood. This, of course, comes off the backdrop of Australia, Britain, Canada, and Portugal, who recently on Sunday said they are now formally recognizing Palestinian statehood. France has also announced its intention to do so. How do you expect allies and rivals to react to Trump's remarks?
I think it's not surprising that countries like Britain, France, Belgium, they will not be surprised that President Trump views dimly their move to recognize Palestine. In Washington, I guess the thinking is that recognizing Palestine right now is a sort of reward for Hamas. The American position has long been that recognition of Palestine has to follow a former two-state solution. So both countries decide that they will live peacefully beside each other. And President Trump is very sympathetic to the Israeli cause. I don't see him changing that position. But that said, it is quite impressive that stalwart allies such as France and Britain have gone ahead, having priced in possible American anger and gone ahead and done this move because they truly believe that they need to lock in the two-state solution. And in their calculation, recognizing now does this because they fear, I think, that this right-wing government in Israel may take various other steps, such as annexing the West Bank or parts of the West Bank to further kind of erode the possibility of a future two-state solution.
Yeah, another key player in this Middle Eastern calculus is arguably Iran. I mean, they themselves had a war with Israel back in June, which dealt a pretty heavy blow to their military chain of command. That being said, Iran's president has told the UN that his country will never seek a nuclear bomb. How credible is that message, and how do you expect it to be received by other world leaders?
I think the true position is more nuanced. The kind of relationship that the Iranian government has with the IAEA, the nuclear agency of the UN, has been, I would say, cordial. So that again goes back to why the functioning of the UN is so important and why it should be well funded with talent from around the world, being in the UN, right? So governments supply their officials to the UN to staff various agencies. So this should continue, and is precisely to deal with issues such as arms control and possible errant countries that you need a functioning UN. So it is no point lamenting the behavior of various countries and then the international community is not backing the one organization that was set up to deal with this problem.
All right, moving along to happenings between Russia and Ukraine. We also have Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky telling the UN that his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin will keep driving the war forward. With leaders like Estonia backing that warning, what kind of collective action are they hoping to see from the international community, do you think?
I think countries like Estonia, Poland, they will now still prize the United Nations. Estonia, I think, in an unprecedented fashion, went to the Security Council after this recent incursion of a Russian plane into the airspace. So they still see the Security Council as the place where you go to mediate or deal with serious security issues. But beyond that, they have to look at the various other groups that they are part of, whether it's NATO or the European Union. But again, the UN has to be the place where you deal with these issues. It has to function. When it does not, then there are very dire consequences for the security of these countries.
Let's turn to another hot button issue, Bhavan. Donald Trump also using the forum to dismiss climate change, of course not for the first time. On the other end of the spectrum, Chinese President Xi Jinping struck quite the opposite tone, telling the floor that by 2035, China plans to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 7 to 10% below its peak, and called out, quote, some countries for moving against the global clean energy transition. Now, you could argue that one of those some countries he was referring to is the United States. Do you think we can draw conclusions here about a shifting global world order where Chinese leadership is being increasingly valued or preferred even to U.S. leadership?
Certainly, I mean, smaller powers don't have a choice of deciding, how the great powers act. Certainly, you expect that all the major powers behave responsibly and uphold the international rules-based order, that China is leading the way in some areas, including in taking very seriously climate change and in terms of policy. And, we know about its amazing EV industry. and solar industry as well. So in some areas, it is doing very well. It is really like forerunner and for countries to follow. But in various other areas, they too are lagging. In the South China Sea, of course, there are questions about whether they are upholding or eroding the international rules-based order. Again, for small countries, you need to be able to speak collectively, and that's where multilateral institutions like ASEAN, whether the United Nations are important, to speak up when major powers deviate from the international rules-based order.
All right, final question. We turn to Singapore, which will be delivering its own national statement later this week. Very quickly, what should we watch for in terms of Singapore's positioning in this complex global landscape?
I think Singapore, like other small countries, will say that the United Nations, even its current issues, remains existential to us. Small states require multilateral institutions to amplify our voice, to speak together with others who we make common cause with on various issues, whether it's rule setting on cyber or dealing with climate change or more serious security issues such as the South China Sea and tensions on the Taiwan Strait. So we are not in a position to write off the United Nations. Small states, more than any other country, cannot do that. I think we are very much part of the process of helping to reform the United Nations along with countries like Estonia. I believe the Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan may speak about that. But I think the general message will be that the world more than ever needs the United Nations to be functional, and countries that have the wherewithal and interest in doing so should continue to do so, even as various players seek to undermine the organization.
All right, great stuff. Of course, we still have Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel due to start off speeches on Friday, to be followed by Premier Li Qiang of China, Prime Minister of Britain, and India's Minister of External Affairs as well. So still plenty to come. But dissecting what has happened so far has been Bhavan Jaipragas, Deputy Opinion Editor at the Straits Times. Bhavan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, have a great day. Stay with Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.